poor rancher was forced to marry a 400-pound stranger for a cow, but she locked the door that night. The sound of the key turning shouldn't have made Malachi's hands shake like that. After all, it was his wedding night. But nothing about this arrangement had prepared him for the way Cora moved around the small room, checking the windows, testing the door handle twice, as if she was securing them from something outside. Or someone. He'd expected tears, maybe anger, even disgust. What he hadn't expected was the strange calmness in her eyes when she finally turned to face him, like she'd been planning this moment for months. The woman who'd barely spoken 3 words during the entire ceremony now moved with a purpose that made no sense. "You're wondering why I locked us in," she said, her voice lower than he remembered from their brief meeting that morning. There was something else, too, an accent he hadn't noticed before, refined in a way that didn't match Sterling Boone's crude description of her. Malachi nodded, unable to find words. The arranged marriage was supposed to be simple. His desperate need for cattle to save his failing ranch, her need for what exactly? Sterling had been vague about that part, just mentioning something about her father's debts and limited options for a woman of her size. But now, watching her pull something small and metallic from her dress pocket, something that caught the lamplight in a way that made his breath catch, Malachi realized he'd been asking the wrong questions all along. The real question wasn't why Sterling Boone had been so eager to arrange this marriage, or even why she'd agreed to it. The question was why she'd been asking about him specifically for weeks before Sterling ever approached him about the deal. And why, when she thought he wasn't looking, she'd smiled like she'd just won something she'd been fighting for her entire life. The metallic object disappeared back into her dress before Malachi could get a proper look at it. But the brief glimpse had been enough to send ice through his veins. It looked like a key. Not the iron key she'd just used on the door, but something smaller, more delicate, like the kind that opened jewelry boxes or small safes. Cora moved to the window and peered through the thin curtains, her massive frame surprisingly graceful as she shifted her weight from foot to foot. The moonlight caught the side of her face, and Malachi noticed something that made his stomach drop. Her skin was too clean, too soft for someone who'd supposedly spent years doing hard labor to pay off family debts. Her hands, when she'd signed the marriage papers that morning, had been smooth as river stones. "Your ranch borders the old Miller property," she said without turning around, her voice still carrying that refined accent that hadn't been there during the ceremony. "The section where the creek bends north before it reaches the main road." Malachi's throat went dry. The Miller property had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the family had packed up and left in the middle of the night. No one talked about why they'd gone, but everyone in town knew it had something to do with the strange men who'd been asking questions about land rights and mineral surveys. "How do you know about the Miller place?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Cora finally turned to face him, and in the lamplight, her eyes held a sharpness that made her seem like a completely different person from the bashful woman who'd stood beside him at the altar. "Because I've been watching that creek for 6 months, waiting for the right moment to get access to it." The admission hit Malachi like a physical blow. This wasn't about her father's debts or her limited marriage prospects. This was about his land, specifically the part that connected to the Miller property. But why? What was so important about a stretch of creek and abandoned farmland that someone would go through the elaborate charade of an arranged marriage? "Sterling Boone isn't just a cattle dealer, is he?" Malachi asked, pieces of a puzzle he didn't understand beginning to form in his mind. Cora's expression remained unreadable, but she moved away from the window and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, making the wooden frame creak under her weight. For a moment, the calculating look in her eyes softened, and Malachi glimpsed something that might have been regret. "Sterling Boone is many things," she said quietly. "But tomorrow morning when the sun comes up, you're going to wish you'd never heard his name. Because the cattle he promised you, they're already on their way to your pastures, and once they arrive, there's no going back from what happens next." The way she said it made Malachi's blood run cold. The cattle were supposed to save his ranch, give him the fresh start he desperately needed. But the certainty in Cora's voice suggested they might be the very thing that destroyed him instead. Malachi felt the walls of the small room closing in around him. The woman sitting on his bed wasn't the desperate spinster Sterling had described. She was something else entirely, something that required careful planning and months of preparation. But what terrified him most was the way she spoke about the cattle, as if they were a trap rather than salvation. "What happens when they arrive?" he asked, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded despite the chaos in his chest. Cora studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth he could handle. "They're not ordinary cattle, Malachi. Each one has been specially selected, bred for a very specific purpose. When they graze on your land, particularly near that creek, they're going to uncover something that's been buried there for years." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Malachi thought about all the times he'd walked that section of his property, never noticing anything unusual about the soil or the way the grass grew in strange patterns near the water's edge. But now that he considered it, there had always been something odd about that area. The way his horses avoided drinking from that particular bend in the creek, the way birds never seemed to nest in the trees nearby. "Buried?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. 3 years ago. The night before the Miller family disappeared, someone buried a series of metal containers along that creek bed, Cora said, her eyes never leaving his face. Containers filled with documents that certain powerful people would kill to keep hidden. Sterling Boone has been searching for those containers ever since, but he needed legitimate access to the land to conduct a proper excavation. Malachi's legs felt weak. He sank into the room's only chair, his mind racing through the implications. "And marrying me gives him that access." "Marrying me gives him that access," Cora corrected, "because as your wife, I have legal rights to the property, rights that Sterling can exercise through various business arrangements he's already prepared." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Sterling hadn't been helping a desperate rancher and an unmarriageable woman. He'd been orchestrating an elaborate land grab disguised as charity. But something in Cora's tone suggested there were even more layers to this deception. "Who are you really?" Malachi asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Cora reached into her dress again, this time pulling out a small leather folder that she handed to him with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph of a much younger, much thinner woman in an expensive dress, standing beside a man in a fine suit. The woman's face was unmistakably Cora's, despite the dramatic difference in her appearance. "My name is Cordelia Eastman," she said quietly, "and the man in that photograph is my husband, James Eastman, the same James Eastman whose signature is on every document buried in your creek bed, the documents that prove he's been stealing money from the territorial government for the past 5 years." Malachi stared at the photograph, his hands shaking. "If you're already married, then our ceremony today was illegal." Cora's expression hardened. "Not if James Eastman is dead. Which, according to the official records Sterling helped create, he has been for 6 months. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle between them. "The problem is, James is very much alive, and he has no idea that I've just become legally free to testify against him." The sound of hoofbeats outside made both of them freeze. Malachi moved to the window and peered through the curtains, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the moonlight, he could see at least 20 head of cattle being driven toward his pastures by 3 men on horseback. Even from this distance, something about the riders made his skin crawl. They moved with military precision, not like ordinary ranch hands delivering livestock. "They're early," Cora whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Sterling said they wouldn't arrive until tomorrow afternoon." Malachi turned back to her, the photograph still clutched in his trembling hands. "Why is he moving faster than planned?" "Because someone else is coming," she said, rising from the bed with surprising urgency for someone of her size. "James has been tracking me for weeks. If he's figured out where I am, Sterling needs those documents before my husband arrives with federal marshals." The implications hit Malachi like a physical blow. His ranch was about to become the center of a conflict between corrupt government officials, federal law enforcement, and whoever else wanted to get their hands on evidence that could apparently destroy careers and lives. And he was trapped in the middle, legally bound to a woman whose very existence was part of an elaborate deception. "What happens to me when this is over?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Cora's expression softened with something that might have been genuine regret. "Sterling can't leave witnesses, Malachi. Once those documents are recovered, anyone who knows about their existence becomes a liability. That includes you, me, and probably those ranch hands driving the cattle." The casual way she spoke about their impending deaths made Malachi's stomach churn. But worse than the fear was the growing realization that he'd been manipulated from the very beginning. His desperate need for cattle, his failing ranch, even his reputation as an honest man who minded his own business, Sterling had used every vulnerability against him. "There has to be a way out of this," he said, more to himself than to Cora. "There is," she replied, pulling another item from her dress. This time it was a small piece of paper, folded several times. Before I gained all this weight, before I became Cora Maddox, I was an accountant. I know exactly what's in those buried containers, and I know how to use that information. Malachi unfolded the paper and found himself looking at a detailed map of his own property, with X marks indicating precise locations along the creek bed. But what made his blood run cold was the realization that one of the X marks was positioned directly under his house. Sterling doesn't know about the container buried beneath your cellar, Cora continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The one that contains the original contracts James signed with the territorial governor. If we can reach it before Sterling's men finish their excavation, we might have enough evidence to turn the federal marshals against him instead of us. Outside, the sound of cattle lowing grew louder, and Malachi could hear voices shouting commands. The men were getting closer, and with them came the machinery of Sterling's plan. But now, looking at the map in his hands, Malachi realized that the man who'd tried to use him might have made one critical miscalculation. The most damaging evidence wasn't buried where Sterling thought it was. It was directly beneath their feet, and only Cora knew how to find it. A sharp knock on the door made them both jump. The sound was too controlled, too measured to be friendly. Malachi looked at Cora, whose face had gone pale despite her earlier composure. "Malachi Brooks," a man's voice called from outside. "We need to discuss the cattle delivery." It wasn't Sterling's voice. This man spoke with the crisp pronunciation of someone educated back east, someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. Malachi recognized the tone from his brief time in the territorial army. This was the voice of someone who considered human life expendable. "Don't answer," Cora whispered urgently. "That's Theodore Grimm, Sterling's partner. If he's here personally instead of just sending his men, it means something's gone wrong with their timeline." The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Brooks, I know you're in there with your new bride. Congratulations on the marriage, by the way. Sterling speaks very highly of both of you." Malachi felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool night air. The way Grimm emphasized the word both suggested he knew exactly who Cora really was. Their carefully constructed deception was already unraveling, and they hadn't even made it through their first night as husband and wife. "We have about 30 seconds before he stops being polite," Cora said, moving toward a corner of the room where the floorboards looked slightly different from the rest. "Help me move this rug." Malachi knelt beside her and pulled back the small woven rug, revealing a section of flooring that had been carefully cut and fitted back into place. Beneath it was a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "This leads to the cellar?" he asked. "It leads to a crawl space that connects to your cellar," Cora corrected. "I had it prepared months ago, back when I was still trying to figure out how to get access to your property without arousing suspicion." The admission that she'd been planning this infiltration for months should have angered Malachi, but he found himself impressed by her thoroughness. Whatever else Cora might be, she wasn't someone who left things to chance. "Mr. Brooks," Grimm's voice came again, but this time it was accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps and what might have been the metallic click of weapons being readied. "I'm afraid I must insist on speaking with you immediately. We've had some concerning developments regarding your property that require immediate attention." Cora was already lowering herself through the opening, her substantial frame making the process slow and difficult. "Once I'm down, hand me that lamp and follow immediately," she whispered. "Leave everything else behind." Malachi grabbed the oil lamp and watched as Cora disappeared into the darkness below. But as he prepared to follow her, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Through the thin walls of his house, he could hear the unmistakable sound of shovels striking earth and men calling out coordinates to each other. Sterling's excavation had already begun. While Grimm kept them occupied at the front of the house, other men were digging up his property, systematically searching for the buried containers. But worse than that was the realization that they were digging in the wrong places. If they continued their current pattern, it would only be a matter of time before they realized their mistake and turned their attention to the area beneath the house itself. "Malachi," Cora's voice drifted up from below, urgent and strained. "You need to see this. The container under your cellar. It's already been opened." Malachi dropped through the opening and landed hard on the dirt floor of the crawl space, the lamp's flame flickering dangerously with the impact. The space was barely tall enough for him to crouch, and the air was thick with the smell of disturbed earth and something else. something metallic and unpleasant that made his stomach turn. Cora was kneeling beside a rectangular hole in the ground, her hands covered in fresh dirt. The metal container she'd mentioned lay open beside the excavation, its contents scattered across a piece of canvas she'd apparently brought with her. But what made Malachi's breath catch wasn't the documents or the obvious signs that someone had been here recently. It was the dark stains on the canvas that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Someone was killed for this," Cora whispered, holding up a leather journal with pages that had been hastily torn out. "Look at the binding. You can see where the blood soaked through." Above them, the sound of splintering wood indicated that Grim had lost patience with waiting. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor of Malachi's house, accompanied by voices calling out search patterns. They had minutes, maybe less, before the men above realized there was accessible space beneath the building. "What was in the journal?" Malachi asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the chaos above and the evidence of violence below. "Records of payments James made to territorial officials, including judges and federal commissioners," Cora replied, her fingers trembling as she sorted through the remaining documents. "But more importantly, there's a list of witnesses who were supposed to testify about the corruption. Half the names have been crossed out in red ink." The implications hit Malachi like a physical blow. The crossed-out names weren't just witnesses who'd changed their minds or moved away. They were people who'd been silenced permanently, and whoever had opened this container before them now had a complete list of targets. "We need to get out of here," he said, but Cora was shaking her head. "There's something else," she said, holding up a single sheet of paper that looked different from the others. "This is a telegram, dated 3 days ago. It's addressed to Sterling Boone, and it's from James." Malachi leaned closer to read the brief message in the lamplight, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The telegram contained only a few lines, but they were enough to change everything. "Wife located. Stop arriving with federal marshals dawn. Stop eliminate all evidence and witnesses. Stop no exceptions. Stop. James isn't coming to rescue you," Malachi realized, his voice barely audible. "He's coming to make sure you can never testify against him. And Sterling isn't just trying to cover up the corruption," Cora added, her face pale in the lamplight. "He's been working for James all along. This entire arrangement, the marriage, the cattle, even my presence here, it was designed to lure me into a trap where James could eliminate me legally." The sound of footsteps above suddenly stopped, replaced by voices conferring in urgent whispers. Then came the unmistakable sound of furniture being moved and floorboards being pried up. Grim's men had figured out there was space beneath the house. "There's one more thing," Cora said, reaching into the container and pulling out a small metal object that gleamed in the lamplight. "This key opens a safety deposit box in the territorial capital. According to this note, it contains enough evidence to bring down not just James, but the entire network of officials he's been paying." But as she spoke, the sound of splintering wood directly above them indicated that their hiding place had been discovered. Light from torches began filtering down through newly created gaps in the ceiling, and Malachi could hear Grim's voice giving orders to his men. "Find them," Grim said, his tone as cold as winter steel. "And make sure neither of them leaves this property alive." Cora grabbed Malachi's arm and pointed toward the far end of the crawl space, where he could barely make out what looked like another opening. "There's a tunnel that leads to the old root cellar behind your house," she whispered urgently. "But we have to move now, before they get torches down here." They crawled through the narrow space as quickly as Cora's size would allow, the sounds of destruction above them growing louder with each passing second. Malachi could hear Grim shouting orders about bringing shovels and picks to break through the floor more efficiently. But worse than that was the sound of horses approaching from multiple directions, suggesting that reinforcements were arriving. The tunnel Cora had mentioned was barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, and Malachi found himself wondering how she'd managed to construct this elaborate escape route while maintaining her cover as a simple woman seeking marriage. The level of planning and physical effort required suggested capabilities that went far beyond accounting skills. "How long have you been preparing for this?" he asked, as they emerged into the larger space of the root cellar. 2 years, Cora replied, breathing heavily from the exertion. "Ever since I discovered that James had been systematically murdering anyone who could expose his operation. I knew that eventually he'd come for me, so I started planning my own death." "Your own death?" "Cordelia Eastman had to disappear completely for this plan to work," she explained, moving toward what appeared to be supplies cached in the corner of the cellar. "I gained 60 pounds, changed my appearance, created an entirely new identity as Cora Maddox. Even my own mother wouldn't recognize me now. The dedication required for such a transformation was staggering, but it also raised disturbing questions about everything Malachi thought he understood about his situation. If you've been planning this for 2 years, why did you need me? Why not just disappear entirely? Cora's expression grew grim as she pulled a rifle from her cache of supplies. Because James has connections with federal marshals, territorial officials, even some military commanders. Simply disappearing wouldn't have been enough. I needed to die publicly, in a way that would generate official records and witnesses. The implication hit Malachi like a sledgehammer. The marriage wasn't just about getting access to my land. You were planning to be murdered here, as my wife, so that Cordelia Eastman would be legally declared dead. And you were supposed to be killed as well, as the unfortunate husband who got caught in the crossfire, Cora admitted, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. Sterling promised James that both of us would be eliminated tonight, along with all the evidence. But what Sterling doesn't know is that I've been sending copies of every document to a federal prosecutor in the territorial capital. Outside, the sound of breaking glass indicated that Grimm's men were no longer being subtle about their search. Voices called out coordinates and search patterns, and Malachi could hear the distinctive sound of metal tools striking earth as the excavation expanded beyond the house itself. There's something else you need to understand, Cora continued, her voice taking on an urgency that made Malachi's skin crawl. The cattle Sterling delivered aren't just a cover story for the excavation. Each animal has been branded with a mark that identifies them as stolen federal property. When James arrives with the marshals, he's going to claim that you and I are cattle thieves who killed Sterling and Grimm when they tried to recover the stolen livestock. The sophistication of the frame job was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Every element of their situation had been carefully constructed to ensure that both Malachi and Cora would be branded as criminals before they were killed, making their deaths not just legal, but commendable law enforcement actions. But as Cora finished explaining the scope of the conspiracy against them, a new sound reached their ears from outside the root cellar. It was the unmistakable thunder of many horses approaching at full gallop, far more than Sterling or Grimm would need for a simple recovery operation. "James is early," Cora whispered, her face going pale. "He was supposed to arrive at dawn, but if he's here now, it means someone warned him that federal investigators were getting close to the truth." The thunder of approaching horses grew louder, and through the small window of the root cellar, Malachi could see torches moving across his property like deadly fireflies. James had brought at least 30 men, far more than would be needed for a simple arrest. This was the force of someone who intended to leave no witnesses and no evidence behind. Cora was methodically checking items from her cache of supplies, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this moment countless times. She pulled out a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins, a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth, and something that made Malachi's breath catch, a badge that clearly identified her as a federal investigator. "You're not just an accountant," he said, the pieces finally falling into place. "Special investigator for the Territorial Treasury Department," Cora confirmed, pinning the badge to her dress. "We've been tracking James Eastman's operation for 3 years. But he had so many people in his pocket that traditional investigation methods were useless. The only way to get close enough to gather evidence was to become someone he trusted completely." The sound of voices grew closer, and Malachi could hear James himself shouting orders about securing the perimeter and ensuring no one escaped. But there was something else in his voice, an edge of panic that suggested things weren't going according to his plan either. "If you're a federal investigator, why haven't you called for backup?" Malachi asked. "I did," Cora replied, pulling out a small mirror and using it to flash reflected light through the window in a specific pattern. 3 hours ago, but James moved faster than we expected, which means someone in the federal marshal's office warned him that we were close to making arrests. The implications were staggering. The corruption reached so deep into the territorial government that even federal law enforcement couldn't be trusted. But as Cora continued signaling with the mirror, Malachi began to understand that her plan was far more sophisticated than he'd realized. "That signal you're sending," he said, watching her repeat the same pattern of flashes. "Someone's waiting for it." 47 federal troops are positioned 2 miles south of here, Cora confirmed. "They've been waiting for my signal since sunset, ready to move in and arrest everyone involved in the operation. But they needed confirmation that we'd gathered enough evidence to make the charges stick." Outside, The sound of gunshots erupted as James's men apparently encountered unexpected resistance. But instead of the random pattern Malachi expected, the shots came in organized volleys, suggesting that whoever was shooting back had military training and superior positioning. The troops are already here, Malachi realized. Some of them, Cora agreed, hefting the rifle and moving toward the cellar door. But James still has more men, and he knows this terrain better than they do. The real battle is just beginning. As if to confirm her words, a voice Malachi recognized as Sterling Boone's called out from somewhere near the house. "James, the containers are empty. Someone got here before us and removed all the documents." The response was immediate and violent. James's voice rose above the chaos, screaming orders about finding the missing evidence and eliminating everyone involved. But worse than his rage was the cold calculation that followed it. "Burn everything," James commanded. "The house, the barn, the root cellar. If we can't control the evidence, we'll destroy it all and claim the criminals attacked federal officers." Malachi felt ice form in his stomach as he realized the full scope of James's desperation. Rather than retreat or negotiate, the man was prepared to commit mass murder and arson to cover his tracks. And with corrupt officials in the marshal's office, he might actually succeed in framing the entire incident as a law enforcement victory. But as the smell of smoke began filtering into the root cellar, Cora did something that changed everything. She pulled out the small key she'd recovered from the buried container and held it up in the lamplight. "This opens a safety deposit box that contains copies of every document we just found, but more importantly, it contains a complete list of every corrupt official James has been paying, including 3 federal marshals and a territorial judge." The smell of smoke intensified, but before James's men could complete their arson, the thunder of organized cavalry filled the night air. Cora's signal had worked perfectly. The federal troops she'd contacted weren't just arriving. They were surrounding the entire property with military precision that James's hired guns couldn't match. Malachi heard Sterling Boone's voice rise in panic as he realized they were trapped. "James, we've got federal cavalry on 3 sides and more coming from the south. This isn't just a few marshals. This is a full military operation." The gunfire outside shifted from chaotic exchanges to the systematic advance of trained soldiers. Within minutes, the sounds of battle gave way to shouted orders for surrender and the metallic click of weapons being laid down. James Eastman's voice, which had been commanding and violent just moments before, became pleading as he apparently realized the scope of the force arrayed against him. "Come out with your hands visible," a commanding voice called from outside the root cellar. "This is Colonel Morrison, 5th Territorial Infantry. The property is secured." Cora stood and straightened her dress, transforming from a desperate fugitive back into a federal investigator with practiced ease. "That would be my superior officer," she said to Malachi with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Colonel Morrison has been coordinating this operation from the beginning." They emerged from the cellar to find James Eastman on his knees in the dirt, hands shackled behind his back, while federal soldiers methodically arrested his men. Sterling Boone and Theodore Grimm were already secured in a military wagon, both looking as though they couldn't quite believe how quickly their elaborate scheme had collapsed. Colonel Morrison, a weathered man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, approached them with obvious relief. "Agent Eastman," he said, addressing Cora by her real name and title. "Your signal came through perfectly. Do you have the evidence?" Cora handed him the small key and the bundle of documents they'd recovered. "Everything we need to prosecute the entire network, sir. Financial records, payment schedules, and a complete list of corrupted officials. The safety deposit box in the territorial capital contains enough additional evidence to ensure convictions for everyone involved." James Eastman's head snapped up at the mention of the safety deposit box, his face going pale as he realized that his wife had outmaneuvered him completely. "Cordelia," he said, his voice breaking, "we can work something out. I can make this right. My name is Agent Cora Eastman of the Federal Treasury Investigation Unit," she replied coldly. "And you have the right to remain silent before your trial for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the territorial government." Colonel Morrison turned to Malachi, who was still trying to process the rapid transformation of his quiet ranch into a military operation. "Mr. Brooks, you've provided invaluable assistance to a federal investigation. The territorial government will compensate you for any damage to your property and ensure that your cattle operation receives the support it needs to succeed." As dawn broke over the property, Malachi watched federal soldiers load James, Sterling, and their co-conspirators into military wagons, for transport to the territorial capital. The cattle that had been delivered as part of the elaborate frame job were indeed marked as stolen federal property, but Colonel Morrison assured him that the charges would be dropped and the animals would remain on his ranch as compensation for his cooperation. Cora approached him as the last of the prisoners were loaded into wagons. She had removed the padding that had transformed her appearance, revealing a woman who was still substantial, but no longer the massive figure she'd presented during their false marriage. The marriage ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace who was working with James, she explained. Legally, it was never valid, so you're free of any obligations there. 6 months later, Malachi received word that James Eastman and his entire network had been convicted on federal charges, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life in territorial prison. Sterling Boone and Theodore Grimm were executed for their roles in multiple murders. Agent Cora Eastman had been promoted and transferred to investigate corruption in the state government. Malachi's ranch thrived with the federal cattle and compensation money, and he eventually married a local schoolteacher who appreciated both his honesty and his remarkable story about the night he helped bring down the most extensive corruption network in territorial history. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and deception collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.